Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to go through the key studies for social stratification, so enjoy. So the first study I've got is Davis and Moore, who write from a functionalist perspective, and they argue that social stratification is a universal necessity for all societies because they believe that all roles must be filled, so like jobs mostly, and these jobs must be filled by those who are best able to perform them, and this can only happen in a society that places unequal rewards and privileges onto different positions in society. And so by attaching high rewards to the more functionally important positions, those with ambition and with the skill will compete for these jobs, and then the ones who are the most talented and the most ambitious will achieve success. But then we can look at criticisms of this study, and we can argue that some occupations have less prestige and lower economic rewards but are still functionally important to society, so nurses for example. And also it becomes quite difficult to measure somebody's talent, and you can argue that talent might not actually be needed for the most important positions in society. Davis and Moore would also argue that the time people spend on education to get into these higher jobs that have the biggest rewards, and another reason why they have such big rewards because they've worked so hard to get there. But then some people would argue that education is actually a privilege in itself, as a lot of people like to learn, and that can be seen as something that is enjoyment rather as something that deserves to be rewarded for your entire life. So the next sociologist we can talk about is Devine, who tested Goldthorpe's theory of privatised instrumentalism in the working class, and this is a study but not in like the key study list, and he basically just figured out that the new working class, as he called it, liked to spend more time at home and didn't really see their work as enjoyment. They saw it more as a way to make ends meet. But anyway, Devine went against this, and she revisited Luton, where the study took place, at a Vauxhall employment, and she didn't find any evidence of this privatised instrumentalism. She agreed that this different working class wasn't as communal as the traditional working class, so they spent less time together and more time at home, but they weren't as privatised as expected either. And she also denied that the working class, who were more affluent workers in this case, had been persuaded to accept capitalism uncritically. She still saw them as being rather resentful of the privileges of inherited wealth and people at the very top of society, and still continued to hold an extreme sense of injustice about these extreme class inequalities. And the next study we can talk about is Marx, who saw social stratification as a mechanism which allows the privileged few to exploit the many in the lower classes. He believed that the ruling class, so the class at the top, held its power due to controlling the economy and controlling all means of production. And the ruling class ideology seeks to justify ruling class domination through ideas such as the free market, so basically the idea that you can work hard and gain rewards, so quite similar to meritocracy. And he believed that this ideology distorted reality for many in the lower classes to distort their view of capitalism to make it a positive view rather than a negative view that it should have been. And he believed that members of the lower class who accepted this status are victims of something called false class consciousness. So basically they believe that they're in a good position and they're not being exploited when in reality they are. And also he saw capitalism by its very nature to be unstable due to the conflict between those who exploit the labour and those who are exploited themselves, so again the lower classes. And so he believed that the gap would become greater between the bourgeoisie, so the rich at the top, and the proletariat, so the working class at the bottom. And he called this polarisation, so basically the two classes are going to get further apart and more distant in their inequalities. And so from this he predicted a proletariat revolution, which means that the working class would rise up and overthrow the ruling class, and then this would cause an ideal communist society, which you can criticise through in the past, where we can see communist societies not working out very well and being dictatorships and oppressive to their civilians. The next sociologist is Murray, who writes from a new right perspective, and he argued that American society had a growing underclass, so basically the people at the very bottom, below the working class, and he believed this happened due to people becoming dependent on the welfare state, which is basically the benefit system, so people are getting money who don't have jobs. And he believed that this stopped self-sufficiency and discouraged people trying to find jobs, especially the younger generations, and he saw this as a burden on taxpayers. And he also came to Britain and saw the same situation here and believed benefits encouraged people who were unemployed to remain unemployed. And then, as you can imagine, he gets criticised for this study, and you can argue that many in the underclass actually do have conventional attitudes and want to have stable relationships and also maintain paid employment. And so you can see the underclass as victims of social inequality rather than the problem of society's problems as Murray paints it to be. Our next study is from Townsend, and he identified 3 ways to measure poverty. He's just the poverty guy. And his first way is official statistics, which are based on the state's standard of poverty, which is pretty much his income. And then he looked at relative income, which is the standard of poverty based on households whose income is below the average for similar households in the area. And then his final and his preferred method to use is relative deprivation, which is when a household lacks the resources to meet the standards of other households in that area that are available. And his research was quite thorough. It was based on 2,000 households and 6,000 individuals. And he used something called a deprivation index. It's basically like a list of requirements, and like if you had a certain requirement, you would like put a number, and then the numbers would signify if you were living in poverty in his opinion or not. And they covered variables such as diet, clothing, etc. And he found that 22% of the population in Britain to be living in poverty, compared to 6% for the state standard and 9% using relative income. And so he was criticised for this study a bit for having an inadequate index, which caused potentially misleading results. For example, on his index he talks about having meat, and if you don't have meat in your meals, it's seen as a sign of poverty, but you ignore the fact that people could be vegetarian. The next sociologist is Walby, is how I'm assuming you say it, and she writes from a feminist perspective, and she argues that the patriarchy is central to our understanding of society, and she describes 6 patriarchal structures which restrict women. So first, she talks about paid work, so how women are disadvantaged in the labour market, so getting jobs, maintaining jobs, etc. And then she talks about patriarchal relations of production, which means that men exploit women by gaining benefit from their free and unpaid labour in the home. So women doing domestic duties, cooking, cleaning, they're not paid for it, yet men benefit from it in the household. And then she talks about patriarchal culture, where women tend to have different expectations to men. And then she talks about sexuality, which specifically just means double standards between men and women. So men with multiple partners can be admired, but often women having multiple sexual partners is condemned. And then she talks about male violence towards women, so domestic abuse, etc. And then she finally goes on to talk about the state, and she argues that the gender pay gap and differences in opportunities, so for example the glass ceiling, which is the metaphorical barrier that stops women succeeding and getting higher positions in jobs, and she argues that the state doesn't necessarily enforce it, but doesn't really do much to help or to stop it. So the last sociologist we can talk about is Weber, who provides a more complex picture of social stratification than Marx, but they still do have quite similar ideals. So he argues that classes develop in market economies where individuals compete for economic gain. So when you get people who are at different levels in the economic system, that's when the classes start to develop. And like Marx, he argued that the major class division lay between those who own the means of production, so the ruling class at the top, and those who don't, so those at the bottom, the working class, etc. But he, unlike Marx, saw different classes within those who don't own the means of production, so working class and middle class alike. And he also saw no evidence of polarisation between classes, So whereas Marx described this gap between them and the inequality becoming wider, Weber didn't see this and believed instead the middle class was expanding when capitalism started to develop. Weber also distinguished 3 types of power, unlike Marx, who just focused on economic power. So he first looked at charismatic power, so power from a leader figure that people obey because they see them as having extraordinary human qualities, so Hitler, for example. And then he talked about traditional power, so for example the power of the monarchy in Britain. People obey the monarchy just because they've been around for a while and it's tradition. And then also rational legal power, which is based on shared rules and shared values in society. And he also predicted groups specifically concerned with political or social power to come together, and he called these parties, which we see with our political parties, Tories, Labour, etc. And then we also see this in pressure and interest groups. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please subscribe for more videos coming soon. The next sociologist is Walby, is how I'm assuming you say it, and he writes, is it she?